So, Mordremoth looks badass and all, but what exactly is an Elder Dragon? Where do they originate? And can we in fact kill them? Welcome to Mindspike. Alright, before we dive into this subject, I want you to cast aside any and all presupposed notions you may have towards dragons and dragonkin in the realm of fantasy. You good? Because in the case of Guild Wars 2, we will have to go really deep to uncover the truth. So during this weekend at TwitchCon, many of you may have watched the official launch trailer for Guild Wars 2's first expansion, Heart of Thorns. So did I, obviously, and may I say that it was gorgeous. In it, we get our first look at Mordremoth, the jungle dragon. We know that it's Mordremoth simply because we know that the voice actor in the trailer is Nolan North and he does the voice of Mordremoth. So yeah. In the trailer, we see the Elder Dragon rise from the deep and take shape with this chaotic entanglement of vines. Now, at first, to many, it may come off as him simply being these vines, giving him the ability to shapeshift into anything, but when I first saw this, I was mind blown completely because lately, I've been heavily contemplating the true nature of magic in light of some recent information. More on that in a second though, but first let's step back for a minute and just get a quick grasp of the knowledge we have of the Elder Dragons so far. As far as we know, there exist 6 Elder Dragons, though one of them technically is still a rumor to a certain extent, but nevertheless, we have Primordius, Jormak, Citan, Kralkatorrik, Mordremoth, and the deep sea dragon amply named Steve by the community. Each of these Elder Dragons inhabit a specific sphere of influence, so to speak. Primordius is fire, Jormak is ice, Citan is death and shadows, Kralkatorrik is crystal, Mordremoth is plant and mind, and Steve's sphere is currently unknown as well as his name, though we theorize it to have some affiliation with water one way or another. Also, if we want to get real nitpicky, really the only confirmed spheres of influence are that of Mordremoth and Citan, but to us right now, that knowledge is somewhat inconsequential. Now, this isn't the first time we've seen magic divided into separate categories. In fact, during the original Guild Wars, we learned that the Bloodstones represented 4 schools of magic: aggression, destruction, preservation, and denial. Now, I won't touch too much on the subject of Bloodstones since that subject deserves an episode in itself. Each of the Elder Dragons goes through something we've come to label as cycles. So far, we only know the current awakening cycle and the one that happened approximately 11,000 years ago. A cycle more or less goes like this. The dragon wakes up and starts consuming any and all magic it can come by, effectively wreaking havoc everywhere it goes in search of this magic. Once most, if not all, magic is consumed, they return to their slumber only to have the magic leak back into the world over the course of several thousand years. Now, we have no idea how old the Elder Dragons are or how they initially came to be. What we do know, though, is that by now they are considered to be as much a part of Tyria as is the sun, moon, land, and seas. They are considered to be forces of nature in and of themselves. In fact, when we, during Season 2, saw a glimpse of the All, it seemed as if the Elder Dragons were powerful enough to simply be depicted as astronomic beings. Now, if we decide to go with the analogy of space, it would seem as if magic exists and function much like a solar system. Let's then assume that at the beginning of time, magic would have behaved much like we imagine the Big Bang would have in our real world. Magic would have exploded into every corner of the mists, and over several millennia it would settle somewhere. Now, let's assume that instead of gravity pulling magic together, every piece, for lack of a better term, has its own will to a certain degree. Now, for the benefit of this theory, let's then assume that magic acts much like atoms do, in that certain aspects of magic will seek out other correlating aspects of magic, just like hydrogen and oxygen may form the simple bond that is water. This would imply the notion that magic, to a certain degree, and probably more so than we would regard an atom, is a living thing. And with that notion comes the idea of possible intelligence. What if magic could indeed act much like the same building blocks for life as would an atom? Well, if this is the case, what would then happen in Tyria when a huge amount of magical energy was suddenly brought together? Actually, We recently saw this in the Thaumanova reactor. The anomaly happens. The inquest at the Thaumanova reactor tapped into a huge surge of energy, and suddenly this being appeared. And on top of that, this anomaly essentially seems to be a sentient thing. But how can that be if not for the fact that magic inherently holds a key to life and existence? Funny thing is that this isn't the only time we see this event happening. Well, technically, so far this anomaly is the only being we've seen being born from an immense gathering of magic, but apparently inside the coming raids for Heart of Thorns we indeed see 3 such creatures who each seem to house their own aspect of magic. Oh, and where exactly do they seem to appear in this picture? On a bloodstone. So yeah, magic. Now I realize that life and existence can be wide terms, because in fact what we see is that magic doesn't have the ability to take on solid form. In our terms, it doesn't possess the same solidity as a gathering of atoms would. And so let's all just agree to restrict our definitions of life, in this case, to the simple existence of intelligence. Though that practically excludes all ranger pets. On that previous note though, what happens when a magical entity decides to inhabit the mortal realm by taking refuge in actual atoms? This appears to be what happens when elementalists seemingly create sentient beings out of the elements, and when necromancers reanimate life. They're not creating life per se, they are imbuing an element of choice with enough magic to manifest a low intelligence within the atoms. Now imagine such a gathering of magic taking place unhindered over millennia. Imagine if primordial magic could grow infinitely. What we could end up with is, in my belief, the creation of the same beings we regard as elder dragons. This means that essentially every single elder dragon is nothing more than a gigantic clump of magic imbued into an element of choice, most likely determined by its magical affiliation, meaning this and all these vines isn't exactly Mortarmoth. More likely, this purple glow in itself is probably a much more precise depiction of the dragon. And so now you may ask, well, what about Saitan? He looked real enough. Look at that face, and the fact that every part of his physical appearance in reality is just the tissue from other formerly living beings. Now look at that green glow. Need I say more? But what about their minions and champions then? This is a curious one indeed. My assumptions would be that every minion and champion in their magical essence once upon a time must have been part of the original clump of magic, or must have been imbued or corrupted by this original clump of magic that we call the Elder Dragon. Basically, this is what I believe happens when a minion is made by an Elder Dragon. A tiny part of the Elder Dragon breaks off to reside in this new form as a new entity, though due to the magical connection of them simply being imbued with the dragon's essence, these new entities are essentially still linked to their initial creator, and in some cases we may even go as far as to say that they indeed are just an extension of their creator. So really, Tequatl, the Claw of Jormag, the Shatterer, and Glint could have initially been born as simple clumps of magic in themselves, broken off from their master. Just like we could imagine a planet breaking into smaller pieces, only for that piece to go in orbit around that same planet. They essentially have similar origins, but we distinguish them as separate objects, like the Earth and the Moon. Don't believe me? Listen to this. Enough said. In tandem with this thought exists a thought experiment raised by many psychologists when discussing the existence of a self in human beings. It goes something like this. We are nothing but a pile of atoms, the building blocks that make up everything in our universe, from mountains to vanilla pudding. Now, imagine we had an atom exchanging machine which traded one atom at a time from your body with the body of, say, that of Colin Johansson. At what point would you cease to be you, and vice versa for Colin? In the case of the champions of the Elder Dragons, though they are simply broken off parts of the Elder Dragons, they in fact seem to have their own persona. Take Glint for example. The Forgotten were able to break her bond, the gravitational pull, if I may, to Kralkatori, which let her exist freely as a separate entity, just like we see in the case of the Pale Tree and the Sylvari. I could honestly go on with different examples of this from all around the Tyrian globe, but let's cut to the chase. If we agree to follow this logic and assume that Elder Dragons as we know them are nothing more than a massive gathering of magical energy imbued within an element of choice, can we actually ever claim to be able to kill them? Or could they simply reform into another form? That depends. As I see it, there are two ways of accomplishing this. One is that if we, just like in the previously mentioned thought experiment, assume that magic, like atoms, are interchangeable and hold the possibility of creating another intelligence. If we chip away at the magic that make up the Elder Dragon, at what point would this entity cease to exist as we know it? The other assumption lies in the terminology offered up by ArenaNet in the name of the expansion, Heart of Thorns. What if indeed magic could, in a sense, solidify the persona of this collective entity into a tiny core, or a heart, if I may, to form the actual identity of this massive clump of magic? Funny enough, we see this idea of a core appear on all the anomalies right on their faces. This could also explain the small size of Glint's egg, because all it needs to hold is this magical persona contained in a simple core. Either way we look at it, there's a huge chance that we, the player characters, in fact never killed Citan. We most likely just destroyed his mortal shell, leaving his magical essence to run wild or fall into a protective state, heavily unguarded and open to any other power-hungry entity to simply start eating away at his powers, be it one of his former champions or perhaps Morgermoth itself. Thing is that in the case of Morgermoth, he has the ability to inhabit all plant life and not just dead material. In fact, this is exactly what I believe he implies when he says, "I am this world." Meaning, if we actually want to have a chance at destroying Morgermoth, we can't simply rely on destroying his material form, since he can basically be present in everything. We need another magical entity to absorb his power, his magic, and his essence, perhaps by destroying this heart, because without something else to hold this massive amount of primordial magic, it will simply relocate somewhere possibly not pleasant for the sentient beings of Tyria. There's just one problem with this plan though. Remember the space analogy we used to define the origin of magic? Imagine what would happen if all our current Elder Dragons were destroyed, or if one of them were powerful enough to absorb the rest of them and all magic was left to a single entity. What exactly would happen? A Big Bang perhaps? And if so, how many times have this happened before? Was this truth the single reason why Abaddon decided to allow humans to access magic in the first place, to try and save the universe from destruction? Now I realize that there's a million aspects to this theory that I did not touch on in this video, regardless of how many thoughts I have on the subject at hand. And so as always, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. Ask me anything and let's discuss the Elder Dragons. So far, we can only hope that we perhaps might find some of our answers in the jungle. But for now, that's all I have for you guys this time. Thank you all for watching. Until next time, I will see you in the mists.